They found a king under a parking lot. Not just any king. The guy Shakespeare turned into history's ultimate villain. But when scientists tested his DNA, something came up that was so awkward, so politically inconvenient, that the results got buried faster than Richard himself. Until now. This is the story of how a skeleton in Leicester changed everything we thought we knew about royal bloodlines, legitimate succession, and whether the people running England for centuries actually had any right to the throne at all. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Let's rewind to 2012. A team of archaeologists is digging up a municipal parking lot in Leicester, England. They're looking for the lost grave of King Richard III, the last English king to die in battle. Most historians thought this was a waste of time. Richard's body had been missing for over 500 years. The church where he was supposedly buried had been demolished during the Reformation. The site had been paved over, built on, forgotten. But one researcher, Philippa Langley, had a hunch. She'd been studying old maps, cross-referencing medieval records, and she was convinced she knew where Richard was buried. On the first day of excavation, they found him. Actually, it took them about 2 hours. The skeleton was right there under a parking space marked with a painted letter R. The universe has a sense of humor. The skeleton showed signs of severe scoliosis, a curved spine, exactly as historical accounts described Richard's appearance. And it had battle wounds, serious ones. 9 injuries to the skull alone, including a massive blow to the back of the head that would have sheared off part of the brain. This was a man who died violently, probably after his helmet was removed. The details matched the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, where Richard was killed and the Tudor dynasty began. But here's where it gets interesting. Finding a skeleton is one thing. Proving it's actually Richard III? That requires DNA, and DNA doesn't lie. Or rather, DNA tells truths that people sometimes desperately wish it wouldn't. The University of Leicester brought in geneticists. They needed 2 types of DNA analysis. The first was mitochondrial DNA, which passes down through the maternal line, mother to daughter, unchanged for generations. They tracked down Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker living in London. 17 generations separated him from Richard III, but they shared a direct maternal ancestor, Anne of York, Richard's eldest sister. The mitochondrial DNA matched. Perfect match. The skeleton under the parking lot was genetically linked to Richard's family through an unbroken maternal line spanning over 500 years. That's remarkable enough. But then they did the second test, and that's when everything went sideways. The second test examined Y chromosome DNA. This passes from father to son, down the male line. It should have been straightforward. They tested descendants of Richard's male line relatives. The DNA should have matched other members of the royal Plantagenet dynasty. It didn't. Not even close. The Y chromosome DNA showed that somewhere between Edward III, who died in 1377, and Richard III, who died in 1485, there had been what scientists delicately call a false paternity event. Translation: someone's mother had a child with someone who wasn't her husband. Now you might think, okay, scandal in the royal family, that's not exactly breaking news. Monarchs had affairs, everyone knows that. But here's the problem. If there was illegitimacy in the direct male line between Edward III and Richard III, it doesn't just affect Richard. It affects everyone. Every single monarch who claimed the throne through that bloodline, which is basically everyone. The implications were so massive that the researchers sat on the full results for years. The initial announcement in 2013 confirmed the skeleton was Richard, trumpeted the mitochondrial DNA match, and quietly mumbled something about ongoing genetic studies. The Y chromosome findings? Those got published in academic journals where most people wouldn't read them. No press conferences about that particular discovery. But here's where it gets even better. In 2014, the full genetic study came out. The researchers had to admit it. False paternity events, plural, not just one. They found breaks in the Y chromosome lineage in multiple royal lines. The break could have happened with Edward III's son, John of Gaunt, or it could have been later with one of John of Gaunt's descendants. Either way, the implications were catastrophic for the official story of English royal succession. Let's play this out. John of Gaunt was the son of Edward III. His descendants through his third marriage founded the Tudor dynasty. His descendants through his first marriage were the backbone of the Lancastrian claim to the throne. If John of Gaunt wasn't actually Edward III's biological son, then the entire Wars of the Roses, the conflict that dominated English politics for 30 years and killed tens of thousands of people, was fought over a throne that none of the main claimants actually had a legitimate right to. The Lancasters, illegitimate. The Tudors, illegitimate. And it gets worse. The Tudors led to the Stuarts. The Stuarts led to the Hanoverians. The Hanoverians became the House of Windsor, the current British royal family. Every single monarch since Henry IV who took the throne in 1399 could potentially trace their claim back to a bloodline that wasn't actually royal at all. Now the researchers tried to be careful. They said the break could have happened at several different points. Maybe it wasn't John of Gaunt. Maybe it was later. Maybe it was in a different branch of the family entirely. But the problem is, once you open that door, once you admit that the genetic evidence doesn't support the official genealogy, you can't close it again. And here's the really awkward part. Richard III, the guy everyone remembers as the villain, the supposed usurper, the child murderer from Shakespeare's play, he might have actually had the strongest claim to the throne, because the DNA analysis showed that his mitochondrial line was solid. His maternal ancestry checked out completely. The questions were all about the other branches of the family, the ones that opposed him, the ones that won. The Tudors spent decades painting Richard as a monster. Hunchbacked, evil, power-hungry. They said he murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower, to steal the crown. Shakespeare, writing under Tudor and Stuart patronage, turned Richard into one of literature's greatest villains. Generations grew up believing Richard III was the personification of tyranny and treachery. And it turns out the people making those accusations might have been the actual illegitimate pretenders. History is written by the winners. And the winners have very good reasons to make sure their DNA results don't get too much attention. But wait, there's more. Because in 2025, new analysis has emerged that makes the situation even more complicated. Researchers have been going back through medieval records, looking at descriptions of various royal family members, cross-referencing physical descriptions with what we know about genetic inheritance. And some very interesting patterns are emerging. Edward III had multiple sons. Historical records describe their appearances in detail. Some of this was propaganda, sure, but there are consistent descriptions across multiple sources. When you line up the genetic evidence with these historical descriptions, some of the children don't quite fit the family pattern. The wrong hair color, the wrong build, features that don't match either parent. One study published in early 2025 looked at portraits and death masks of Plantagenet royals, using facial recognition software to map genetic similarities. The results? Multiple potential false paternity events across the family tree. The official genealogy and the genetic reality are two very different things. Now you might ask, why does this matter? These people died hundreds of years ago. Who cares if medieval queens had affairs? Fair question. But here's why it matters. The entire concept of royal legitimacy, the idea that monarchs have a divine right to rule based on their bloodline, collapses if the bloodline is fake. Every law passed by these monarchs, every war fought in their name, every execution carried out under their authority, all of it rests on the foundation of legitimate succession. And that foundation just got a lot shakier. The British establishment is not thrilled about this at all. There have been quiet efforts to downplay the significance of the DNA findings. Lots of talk about how medieval genealogies were always uncertain, how we can't be too rigid about these things, how genetic testing has limitations. All true, technically, but also very convenient arguments when the genetic testing is revealing things you'd rather keep quiet. The Richard III Society, a group dedicated to rehabilitating the king's reputation, has been all over this. They've been pointing out for years that the Tudor version of Richard was propaganda. The DNA evidence supports their case. If the Tudors were illegitimate, then their entire justification for taking the throne, that they were restoring rightful rule after Richard's tyranny, falls apart. Richard might have been the legitimate king all along, fighting against pretenders and usurpers. And then there's the question of what happened to Richard's body after Bosworth. The traditional story is that his corpse was stripped, humiliated, slung over a horse, and buried without ceremony in the Greyfriars Church in Leicester. The DNA evidence confirms he ended up in that church. But recent analysis of the skeleton shows something interesting. The body was buried with some care. The grave was too short, so they had to position the body awkwardly. But it was a proper burial, not just a body dumped in the ground. Someone made an effort. Maybe the people who buried Richard knew something. Maybe there were those in 1485 who understood that the man they just killed in battle actually had a better claim to the throne than the man who'd just taken it. Maybe the hasty burial wasn't just about disrespect, but about getting an inconvenient truth underground as quickly as possible. Literally. The reburial of Richard III in 2015 was a huge event. A specially designed tomb in Leicester Cathedral. Full ceremony. Members of the royal family attended. It was presented as an act of historical reconciliation, giving the last Plantagenet king the dignified burial he'd been denied. But it was also perhaps an attempt to put the whole matter to rest. Bury the king, bury the questions, move on. Except the questions won't stay buried. Because here's the thing about DNA. It's objective. It doesn't care about tradition or legitimacy or centuries of accepted history. It just is. And what it's telling us is that the story we've been told about English royal succession is incomplete at best and fabricated at worst. In 2025, a new push is underway to do more comprehensive genetic testing of other royal remains. There are proposals to exhume and test other Plantagenet and Tudor royals to map out the full genetic picture of the medieval English monarchy. The establishment is resisting hard. Because once you start pulling that thread, the entire tapestry unravels. Think about what this means for the current monarchy. The House of Windsor traces its legitimacy back through centuries of succession, each monarch inheriting the crown from the previous one in an unbroken chain, supposedly going back to William the Conqueror in 1066. But if there are breaks in that chain, if there are multiple false paternity events in the line, then the current royals are on the throne, not because of bloodline legitimacy, but because their ancestors were successful at winning wars and convincing people to accept their rule, which is a very different kind of authority. Some historians argue this doesn't matter, that monarchies have always been about power, not bloodlines. The ability to take and hold the throne is what makes someone a king, not who their great-great-grandfather was. Maybe so. But that's not the story the monarchies themselves have told. They've built their entire claim to authority on the sanctity of royal blood, the unbroken line of succession, the divine right of kings. Take that away, and you're left with something much more fragile. A system based on tradition and acceptance rather than inherent right. The DNA evidence from Richard III's skeleton has opened a box that a lot of people wish had stayed closed. It's raised questions that don't have comfortable answers. And the more we dig, literally and figuratively, the more complicated the picture becomes. Recent studies have also looked at the geographical origins of Richard's genome. Where did his ancestors come from? The DNA shows a mix consistent with English nobility of the period, but also some unexpected elements. Genetic markers that suggest ancestral connections to regions that weren't part of the official royal narrative. Nothing scandalous exactly, but more evidence that the tidy genealogies we've accepted for centuries are oversimplifications at best. And here's something else that came out in 2025. Researchers analyzing the isotopic composition of Richard's teeth and bones can tell us where he lived and what he ate throughout his life. The chemical signatures in his skeleton are like a diary written in atoms. They show he spent his childhood in the north of England, consistent with historical records. But they also show dietary patterns that suggest periods of scarcity, times when even a royal prince wasn't eating as well as you'd expect. The invincible, all-powerful monarchy? Not so much. The story of Richard III's DNA is really a story about how we construct historical truth. For centuries, we relied on written records, which were often created by people with agendas. The Tudors had every reason to paint Richard as a villain. It justified their seizure of power. Later monarchs had every reason to maintain that narrative. It made the whole system look more legitimate. But now we have tools that can fact-check the past in ways that weren't possible before. Genetic analysis, isotope studies, facial reconstruction. These technologies are rewriting history, revealing truths that were hidden or forgotten or deliberately obscured. And sometimes those truths are inconvenient for the official story. The scientific community is pushing forward with more studies. There are proposals to use advanced DNA analysis techniques on other medieval remains to build a comprehensive genetic map of England's royal families. Some researchers want to test remains from the Tower of London, where the princes in the tower were supposedly murdered. If they could find and test those remains, and if they could prove Richard wasn't responsible for their deaths, it would be the final rehabilitation of his reputation. But there's resistance. From the church, which controls many burial sites. From the government, which worries about the political implications. From the royal family itself, which has no interest in having its legitimacy questioned by scientists with DNA sequencers. The truth is, Richard III's DNA revealed something that was always sort of understood but never officially acknowledged. Royal bloodlines are messy. Affairs happen. Illegitimate children get passed off as legitimate. The sanitized family trees in history books are idealizations, not reality. Every family has secrets. Royal families just have secrets that affect national history. What makes the Richard III case so explosive is that the DNA evidence is solid. This isn't speculation or rumor. It's genetic fact. There are false paternity events in the Plantagenet line. The official genealogy is wrong. And once you admit that, you have to admit that maybe the entire structure of royal legitimacy is built on a foundation of convenient fictions. In the end, they found a king under a parking lot, and his bones told a story that no one expected. Not the story of a hunchbacked villain, but the story of a man who might have been the legitimate ruler fighting against illegitimate claimants. Not the story of a dynasty's rightful end, but the story of how history gets rewritten by whoever wins the battle. The truth came out in 2025, not because anyone wanted it to, but because science doesn't care about maintaining comfortable lies. DNA doesn't respect tradition. It just reveals what is. And what it revealed in Richard III's case is that everything we thought we knew about the English monarchy might need to be reconsidered. They tried to hide it. They downplayed it. They buried it along with the king himself. But 500 years in a parking lot couldn't keep Richard's secrets, and neither could centuries of official history. The bones don't lie. The DNA doesn't lie. And now, finally, we're starting to listen to what they're telling us.